Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And in this video, I want to talk about certain features that I believe should become standardized across the entire game. For every race, every faction, every legendary lord. Not necessarily in the same way. I do believe in variety. I do believe that you should have certainly different playstyles to be sure. But there are certain things that Creative Assembly themselves have done, certain ideas, certain mechanics that work so well for specific races that if they were implemented across the board, which would, to be clear, not be an easy thing to do, but it would vastly improve the campaign situation for everyone. Keep in mind, of course, that this would not necessarily inherently fix some of the major problems that specific races do have, like, lizardmen being boring to actually play or having significant issues in terms of everything, their recruitment, their research tree, their economy, the jungle, you can go on. So to start off with, let's talk about instant construction, available to the Chaos Dwarfs, created for the Chaos Dwarfs, added to the Dark Elves. Now I think that Dark Elves are much better suited in Warhammer 3 at the moment, given the meta, the fast-paced meta, 30, 40 turns being the meat of a campaign, being the most consequential portion of a campaign. I think the Dark Elves do far better in that respect. That isn't to say that the Dark Elves don't have certain problems, in the sense that, until you get to like tier 4, you do lack quite a bit of variety in terms of units. Like, you have Dark Shards, you have Blank Arc Corsairs, you have Dread Spears, and maybe Shades if you want them. You could get Cavalry, but given the enemies you're fighting, getting Dark Riders is frankly not worth it. So that is something of a problem in terms of their recruitment options, and why I believe the Dark Elves could certainly use a pass from Creative Assembly to update some of these things. But in terms of instant construction, as a mechanic, it is so brilliant. It is not free. It costs resources that you could spend elsewhere. Specifically, it costs slaves, or if you're playing Chaos Dwarves, laborers. And this is a brilliant system for a couple of reasons. One of the limiting factors in a campaign in Warhammer 3 in terms of pushing player variety, in terms of heroes, in terms of units, in terms of armies, is how long it takes to actually get those buildings. You're limited by how big your economy is, you're limited by the recruitment buildings yourself, and this pretty much applies to every single race in the game, or the vast majority of them. Some races, like the Skaven, do have their own way of tackling this issue, but I believe instant construction is a brilliant way. Again, it would be better if the Dark Elves did have some of these units available at earlier tiers. I think, given the current meta of Warhammer 3, no unit should require more than tier 4 to recruit. That is my perspective. I'm going to stick with that. So that is a problem. But instant construction, because it does cost you resources that you could spend elsewhere, is a brilliant system. Because you can use these slaves for instant construction, but you could also use these slaves for other things as well, like generating money, giving you a lot of growth in a province, giving you control in a province, using the rights to get various benefits in your campaign, being used to maintain the economy. Now, this isn't to say that every race should work like the Dark Elves, but almost every race, except the poor Lizardmen and Norsca, I think that is, almost every race in the game has some unique resource that they could use. Not necessarily every race needs instant construction, but if you look at what Nurgle does, Nurgle has a variant of this as well. Not necessarily like, oh, you build stuff instantly, but it's like you do, but really the cycling there. So there are ways of implementing similar systems for every race. Again, it would take a lot of work, but I think it would really add a lot of variety to a campaign and a lot of choices, consequential ones. The drawback of this system, believe it or not, because this is not just about gaining power or variety, it forces you to decide how you're going to use your resources. Because I'm sure many people have encountered it as either Chaos Dwarves or Dark Elves, or especially Skaven, when you're using some of those limited resources and then you run out. You either run out of the special resource, like food for Skaven, or you run out of slaves for the Dark Elves, or you run out of factions for Nurgle, or you run out of money. That is, by the way, fairly common. So you can overextend yourself, you can make mistakes. And I think that is the brilliant aspect of having some systems in the game, or the capability as a race of going really hard, really fast, and with achieving things like this, like taking Lorem by turn 20 as Marafi, though granted she starts fairly close to it. But at the same time, also having significant consequences if you screw it up, because it is easy to screw it up. It is easy to overextend yourself. It is easy to for this whole thing to end up blowing up in your face. And that is what makes it a brilliant system. It's not just having like buildings being constructed fast, it's how that is done for the Dark Elves in particular. I would also say Nurgle. I think the Chaos Dwarves out of the 3 races I just mentioned here, I think the Chaos Dwarves are actually kind of the weakest right now in the meta. Not because they're a bad race, they're brilliantly designed, it's just the speed, the pacing of their campaigns as opposed to how the game is paced at the moment. So that is one of the features that I think should be standardized across the board in Warhammer 3. Gotta say this very clearly. I understand that there are going to be plenty of people who are going to say, well, we do want races to be varied. Again, you can have a lot of variety, and this would increase variety even further because it would incentivize you to recruit different heroes. It would open up a whole lot of possibilities. And when everyone can do something like that, it changes the game on such a fundamental level. It would be ridiculously good from my point of view. So that's the first thing to talk about over. And number 4, it is the Warbrand Upgrade system from the Warriors of Chaos, added with the Champions of Chaos DLC. To be certain, I don't believe that every race should have this as extensively as the Warriors of Chaos do. And this is not related to the Warband recruitment system, though whether or not more races should have a system like this, like the Empire being able to levy troops, Free Company Militia, Heirs of Sigmar does that. That is a different matter. But I do think that when you have a unit such as, say, Marauders or Jade Warriors, Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, or units with variants like Chaos Dwarves or Dwarf Warriors that just have those variants of shield or grey weapons, being able to switch between them would make battles a lot more interesting because you would be running around with different types of units. I think there is a reason the Warbrand Upgrade mod, which I also have installed right here, is one of the most popular mods for Total War Warhammer 3 because it is a really fun thing to use. Like, hey, I'm dealing with dwarves, let me just switch my guys to from two-handed weapons, which are really good at dealing with melee units, which I did certainly deal with over here fighting Norscan and Azazel, but switching from that to sword and shield or axe and shield in order to deal with Malachi as an example. It is a great system. I think what every race could benefit from, and some more than others, would be just these variants or things like Jade Warriors, things like Empire Swordsmen to Spearmen with shields, those kind of things. Of course, some limits, or many limits, dependent on what we're talking about. You wouldn't want to turn High Elven Archers into Shadow Warriors. I think that wouldn't necessarily make sense, or Sisters of Avalorn. But I do think it would make sense to have some level of variety, like taking High Elven Spearmen and making them Silvering Guard, as opposed to just throwing them away when you can suddenly, when at one point in your campaign you can get to a stage of just being able to instantly global recruit Silvering Guard and just throwing the Spearmen in the dirt. Just a couple of things. Because we do get attached to our armies, we do get attached to our units, and we kind of don't necessarily want to throw those units away. So having an upgrade system where you pay a cost, to be certain, for these kind of upgrades, but still are able to keep the units part of your army, would create some really good incentives, I think, in the game. It would make things more interesting, it would make campaigns more interesting, it would ensure players are not just recruiting an army that they're using in the early game and then throwing that into dirt the moment they can get better units, or even worse, which is actually more typical, just maintaining those armies. I think the worst example of this is actually Cathay. I'm quite serious on this subject. See, in any Cathay campaign that I do currently play, I can conquer all of Cathay by like turn 20 or so. I think that's reasonable. Or get to a stage where that's very, very close. It doesn't matter if it's Yao Ming, Miao Ying, Yan Bo. especially as Xiaoming. Though Yanbo is not necessarily far behind because of all the ridiculous nonsense he can get up to with his special faction abilities. But here's the thing about that. I do so with Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior crossbowmen. At most time I get some peasant archers, maybe Iron Hail Gunners if I get the building up, but that is it. I can tell you that playing every single Kafan campaign, dealing with the same region, with the same enemies, with the same armies, and every single campaign I play as Kafan and dealing with them in the exact same way gets very boring very, very quickly. Even though Cafe is a great campaign area and it's really fun to play through, as a non-Cafe faction. Seriously, playing Cafe in Cafe is pretty damn dull. Playing Lokir in Cafe or playing Snitch, that is a very entertaining experience. But it does come down to some of the design choices of Cafe, but it really does come down to the army choices you do have available, how effective those armies are in terms of cost, how easy they are to recruit. Like Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, you can get those very, very quickly in a campaign. Just start spamming and go yank, spam them. Very few things will stop the horde of Jade Warriors. And then that's it. You end up conquering Cafe with, let's say, 6-10 armies if you're going on an extreme level of that. Do you disband those armies? Why would you? You just spent a lot of money recruiting those armies. They are experienced units. Why would you throw them away? You can still use them. They'll still get the job done. That is kind of the problem that you do encounter. That's one of the things that the Warbrand Upgrade system does help improve on. Again, I do think there should be some limitations, but like, there's Jade Warrior variants as an example. There's Jade Lancers. It would be nice to actually use those in a Cafe campaign as opposed to getting them purely for fluff reasons, as opposed to actually getting them because they're easy to get and they give you variety. One of the worst offenders though in the game I think were the dwarves pre-Thrones of Decay, because post-Thrones of Decay that is a different discussion, right? Lots of variety of units, comes down to recruitment. It does show you that variety doesn't necessarily have to come from one single spot, but with the dwarves, the best dwarf army in every single campaign you could get that you would use for most of the campaign is full-on quarrelers, whatever heroes you could scrounge in a campaign because of dwarf hero recruitment problems, a dwarf lord or a rune lord, more likely, and everything else quarrelers and grudge throwers. That's it. Using anything else was a waste of time, waste of resources, or you couldn't get it because the early game is where it's at. So I do really think that the Warband, like, just consider this army. I didn't go out of my way to make this army as varied as I did. I just recruited whatever I could, right? I also think, like, we could use a more extensive mercenary system, speaking about this, and maybe upgrades to man-eaters and all that, and not just like, oh, you can recruit a man-eater rogue or pistols, right? I think that could work, could be further developed, especially with Cav or, geez, Lead Belchers mercenaries. Just some ideas right there. I think like CA could also improve on that subject. At number 3, we have the instant leveling of settlements from the Skaven. And before you say it, yes, both instant construction and instant high-level settlements. For a major cost, the Chaos Dwarves have this mechanic, and both the Chaos Dwarves and Skaven pay a significant cost to be able to get settlements to tier 5. Be it in terms of influence or in terms of food, because this is pretty painful. In fact, spending this amount of food so early on in a campaign is kinda unnecessary. So you can fall into a trap, but if you do pay that early game price, you can end up with a significant biblical level of power. Thankfully, I have enough money to sustain this for a while. But yeah, like getting Caracade peaks like this is ridiculously good in a campaign, you know, getting all the hero capacity, getting all the wonderful little things that you can do here. That is great. And what this allows you to do is, provided there are other changes, balancing changes early on in the campaign, I think you should not be able to do this freely, but I think being able to do this, as opposed to where in the Skaven situation where every settlement they capture is tier 1 unless they spend food. But being able to do this, though, I'd probably recommend going to tier 4, maybe tier 3. Depends on the settlement. Like with Skaven Blight or with Help It, yeah, abandon them, take them as tier 4 if you can. That would be my recommendation, or tier 3 at least, because of the way the growth in those settlements work. You can take Help It, by the way, as tier 4 on turn 2. Like, abandon it on turn 1, get another settlement, all that. That is a significant advantage. But point is, this actually does give you a lot of unit variety, because you would want these structures, especially as Skaven, right? You would not want to construct things here, you would actually want to construct things over here. So all kinds of different structures. You probably wouldn't care about the clan armory, for instance, but everything else is perfectly fair game. If I had more money, sure, would be a bit different. But it has to be rare, just as it is for Skaven and Cast Dwarves. And it should incur a significant penalty when you do it, like this, because, yeah, otherwise you just end up abusing it. But the possibilities for early game construction and less cheese would be significant. It would also incentivize the player to care about fewer territories. Because one of the problems we have right now in the game is you get to a point in your campaign where you realize that cheesing the AI to region trade, cheesing the AI in Confederation so that you take advantage of the cheap construction that AI has is a really good way to go. But if you're playing Skaven or Cast Dwarves, because they can get high-level settlements very quickly, yeah, sure, you can still cheese diplomacy, don't get me wrong on that, and that's its own kettle of fish. You know, there's balancing discussions to be had on that. As long as you can abuse something, and as long as you're rewarded for it, you're going to want to do it. I think that we should potentially have more money at the beginning of a campaign and more restrictions on region trading. That's my view on that. But point is, being able to do this at a cost is a wonderful system that every faction should have. I think the Cast Dwarves have it better because for the Cast Dwarves, it's only provincial capitals they can do this on, and they do pay a significant cost. And though I'd go even further and say, yeah, you should just be able to capture settlements normally, but you have to pay a significant cost in unique resources or gold or anything like that in order to make this work. That would be my perspective, so lots of balancing, dependent on the race, unique resources, etc. But it is a fantastic system that does add a lot of variety. This is one of the reasons I really like playing Skaven in Warhammer 3. Like, they're actually one of my favorite race, because for all the downsides they have, and make no mistake, they do have them, they're actually as close to a balanced race as you're likely going to get in Warhammer 3. And number 2 is the entire grudge system for the dwarves. Now, this isn't to say every race needs a grudge system, of course, that would be ridiculous, but what every race, every faction, every legendary lord could use is a dynamic objective system with also some fixed objectives. There's a reason why Malachi has one of the most popular campaigns, there's a reason why the dwarves are one of the most played race according to CA's own statistics, and there's a reason I've sunk over 300 hours out of the 3,000 hours I have in Immortal Empires in this campaign alone. It is that good. Malachi goes that extra mile because he has those adventures he goes on, but all dwarves, compared to pre-Thrones of Decay, are in a much better position. Sure, for the end turn button simulator crowd, that might be an issue, but I do think that having systems in game that incentivize you to go out there, do things, get outside your comfort zone is good. Now, this isn't to say that the player should be penalized, or not too heavily on that, for playing more carefully, you know, for learning the ropes. You know, there are new players. There's always new players. There's people learning the game. You shouldn't screw them over. You should create incentives where they're incentivized to get outside their comfort zone. You know, easy to play, hard to master. That's the motto of Blizzard, or it was when Blizzard actually had any relevance. And that's what I think that the system has. Now, some people will always argue, oh, it's too easy. Look, it's a single-player game. If you've sunk 10,000 hours in Total War, you're not going to be challenged by any Total War game. That's not to say that it can't be freaking frustrating, but how you handle the campaign pacing, the objectives, the goals of a campaign is very important. That's what Age of Reckoning does in a couple of ways. One, it gives you the meter over here, which, yeah, you get these grudges. There's some balancing concerns, but that's a balancing issue, not an idea issue. Don't confuse the two. There's some balancing concerns to be sure, but the intent of the system is like, go out there, do stuff. And if you're not going to do stuff, well, you can play more defensively. The dwarves are still a very strong race. I think anyone who complained about the Age of Reckoning system at the launch of Thrones Decade, dude, I gotta say, the dwarves in terms of growth, heroes, unit recruitment, unit variety, it's like a different freaking world of race. So even if you are playing completely statically, ignoring this, by the way, I originally did, or I didn't necessarily max it out, it didn't really hurt you that much, honestly. But it does encourage you and reward you to go out there and do stuff. But beyond the dynamic objectives, you also have these legendary grudges, which give you long-term objectives. There are some balancing aspects here, like I would wish for, say, things like Norska, if, you could do it with your allies. Like, for instance, I like Kislev. I don't necessarily care if they control some of Norska, as opposed to just dwarf factions, or, having to burn the entirety of Athlor. Why can't I ally, Bretonia and do that as well? Just some ideas on that. So there's certainly some balancing concerns, but the intent of the system is freaking fantastic. And then on top of that, what is amazing about the system is that the reward at the end of the day is guaranteed confederation with all the other legendary lords of your race, which adds so much variety to your campaign. This is the real winner of this. Because think of this, you're playing a Malachi campaign or you're playing a Forgrim campaign. Being able to confederate Grombrindal does open up a whole list of possibilities. Same with Forik, Ungrim, doesn't matter. Sure, some are better than others. Grombrindal and Forgrim are the much better choices. Belegar as well, to confederate. But that's a balancing aspect. The intent and how the system works and what it does for a campaign is freaking fantastic. I mean, there's a reason why Karl Franz is really a great Empire campaign, because he also guaranteed confederation. The baseline confederation system of Total War needs to be thrown out the window, as far as I see it. And we need systems like this, where you go out there, you play the game, and depending on how well you play the game, you get rewarded for it. I think that is the best way to handle a single-player game, as opposed to just making it a slow, grindy, and turn button simulator. That would be my perspective. That's one of the reasons I dislike Attila, and I think CA is on the right track with it, with regards to this. Now, this could have been number one, but there is actually something above this. Not necessarily for Warhammer 3, though. At number one is actually a feature from Total War Pharaoh, and not Pharaoh Dynasties, no, a feature that's been present in Total War Pharaoh since the launch of the game, and one of the things that, as far as I'm concerned, saved the game from being an even bigger disaster than what it was. To be certain, they did a lot, especially with lethality, to help improve the situation of Pharaoh Dynasties. And it's actually quite a shame that they've abandoned Pharaoh Dynasties, because while it's not necessarily a really great game right now, it could have been if they had continued rebalancing, adding features, working on it. I understand that from an economic viability perspective, it didn't make sense for them, and it makes more sense to focus on 40k, the Total War, Warhammer 3, and all that. But campaign customization. See, there are always going to be balance issues. There's always going to be questionable situations. There are always going to be situations where you gotta ask yourself, okay, do I want to play a campaign where I start at tier 1 and everyone is starting at tier 1 when we have that slow progression? If you're a veteran Total War player, that does get tiring very quickly. But then you can have this kind of campaign customization system, which unlocks a lot of features from the beginning as opposed to you unlocking them slowly. Speeds up research, so you can actually, get a lot more fun research as opposed to just the most optimal type of research. Those kind of things. This does matter. Now, to be certain, some of the things that they have here aren't particularly great, but that's a balancing decision. However, the intent of it, like unlocking all ancient legacies, unlocking all the gods, etc., it is really good. And that to me made this experience in both the base game and in Dynasties a substantially better one, because I didn't have to deal with cheesing the diplomacy as much if, I can give myself a vast diplomacy modifier in order to make the deals I want, as opposed to me like doing a bunch of region trading in order to get ultimately what I want. I'd still get what I want. I just have to do a bunch more silly steps. To be short, the fundamental issues of diplomacy, region trading, cheesing, the incentives in a campaign where the early game is where you want to focus all your attention, and the end game is and to trivialize the rest of the game. Those are fundamental problems Total War has. But this kind of system does allow you to bypass a lot of these things. And while it isn't available on a baseline level in Warhammer 3, there are mods that do it. But to be clear, Yolosapien has had some of the best ideas in Total War in the history of the series. They've also designed some of the worst battles, and then they fixed those battles by adding lethality in them. Like, seriously, battles in Pharaoh Dynasties are amazing with lethality. I think there should be better systems of this. Maybe I can increase lethality to make those battles better. Maybe I could disable sieges altogether, or change the way the auto-resolve works. There's all kinds of discussion on those systems. Just to mention this, auto-resolve sucks because it shouldn't consider armor. It should consider unit ranks, unit tiers, general tier, all that kind of stuff. Not freaking armor. But there is a way to get this done in Warhammer 3 at the moment. If you are playing Warhammer 3 and want that kind of campaign customization, you do have the mod configuration tool with the ultimate campaign configuration mod. I'll link it in the description below. But this allows you to get like legendary lords to a higher level, get regular lords to a higher level, like instant ranks. It would be nice to give units instant ranks that way, because that would give you army variety from the very beginning, combined with a Warbrand Upgrade mod. So it does need some updates, but you might be surprised how much just giving yourself and the AI a bunch of construction and growth benefits and all that kind of stuff can really improve your campaign. Now, to be sure, I would recommend not necessarily buffing the AI to an extreme over here if you're playing on Legendary, because the AI has already gotten significant buffs. In fact, I would probably increase their upkeep costs so they're running around with fewer armies. But giving more background income, reducing building costs for yourself, all that, these can really make a campaign it's certainly much faster paced and certainly can trivialize things. Though I gotta tell you, it is one thing to deal with a bunch of enemy armies led by rank 1 lords. It is a very different affair when they're all rank 12 or 10 plus lords. That means battles aren't just a complete cakewalk that are an irrelevance, because that's one of the problems that happens in the whole war. Yeah, you might have a couple of challenging battles, but a lot of the battles you're forced to fight by default end up being irrelevant. Well, here, I can tell you they're not necessarily irrelevant. It would be nice if you could actually research all technologies from the beginning. I've tried doing this. It doesn't work. It crashes. It freezes the campaign. But imagine starting a campaign where every race, every legendary lord has every technology unlocked. That would make things really freaking crazy, wouldn't it? A lot more fun, I gotta tell you. Like, Shield Wall might actually use that in Dwarf campaign as opposed to it just being a fluff option that I occasionally use, right? Because the campaign benefits from the top tree from guilds is just much better. But that gives you an idea. Like, it can be done in Warhammer 3. It can work in Warhammer 3. There's no reason why something like this shouldn't be standard. And you can make the campaign slower, harder, if you want to. That is something that does make the game better, those kind of choices. I do think CA should have some presets available, like in terms of like campaign pacing and all that. Like, oh, do you want everyone to start with max level settlements? Do you want everyone to start with a lot of armies and have that have that right to hell available from the very beginning of the campaign? Or do you want things slower, quote unquote, more strategic, as some people say, but just slower? Do you want to, take your time, learn the game mechanics? Because people do need to learn the game mechanics, and they do that by going through all the steps. For those of us that have played the series for 20 years, that's kind of unimportant at this stage, really. But for newer players, it is very important. So it's always a balancing act, and that's where campaign customization can win out, because you can give different types of players many different things. Like, just having different kind of starting situations that you could select from. That would be amazing. That's all I had to say. Questin signing out. Stay tuned for more.